Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining the webinar today. My name is Vanessa. I am a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and I'll be presenting today. So we will be talking about mastering your discussion chapter. So typically that is chapter 5. Just a few things about Statistics Solutions before we get started. We are a full service dissertation editing and consulting company. So if you require some assistance with your dissertation, we do help students all the way from the very early phases, so topic development, through to the final defense. So we do provide support in all of those areas. We have different mentors on staff. So we have mentors who focus on qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and then we also have mentors who focus on the research portions of the dissertation. So the literature search, the introduction, and also the discussion. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation today. But for now, you will see some links in the chat. We do have some free resources on our website. We've got some blog posts, some tools, and also a webinar archive library. We do give webinars pretty frequently throughout the month. Related to all of the different research methods, as well as all of the different chapters in the dissertation. And then we also have some more specialized webinars depending on the type of study you're doing. So different things related to quantitative methods or particular features of quantitative studies that you might have questions about. And then at the end of the presentation today, I will open it up for some question and answers. So feel free to pop questions in the chat throughout, and I'll be sure to go through those at the end. And then lastly, we do offer a free 30-minute consultation. So if after the session today, you feel like you might benefit from some more one-on-one type of assistance, please feel free to reach out. We would love to hear about the research that you're doing and identify any ways that we can best support you. So just to get started on the discussion chapter, like most chapters in your dissertation, this is going to begin with the introduction. Here on this slide, I've listed out the different components that will go in this chapter. So you'll start off with that introduction. You'll go into the interpretation of the findings. Then you'll want to talk about some limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for future research, and then you'll finish it off with a summary, very similar to the other chapters. This list is pretty comprehensive in terms of what should be included in this chapter, but we always recommend to students to check in with your chair or your reviewers and ask them if they have a template or a checklist of what they require. Some schools will have different requirements, so always just make sure you're checking in with them so that you're including all of the information that they expect, and also not making any work, any extra work for yourself by maybe writing a section that actually isn't required by your school. If you don't have a template or checklist available to you, this list again is pretty comprehensive, so this is a good place to start with your discussion. So in the introduction, just like the other chapters, you will want to reorient the reader to your study. So first, you'll start off by restating the purpose of your study. And in doing that, you'll want to be very consistent with the language that you've used throughout your dissertation. So this is not the place where you want to get creative. It can feel repetitive throughout your dissertation to kind of copy and paste that purpose statement, but it's best to just do that to ensure that your reader is very clear on what this study is intended to do. So go ahead and just copy and paste that purpose statement verbatim. Next, you will want to remind the reader of the importance and the need for your study. So again, just highlighting maybe some of the gaps in the literature or some of the things that you have identified as why the study needs to happen. So it could be that you are exploring maybe some variables that haven't been explored before, or maybe you're exploring them through a different lens. So maybe there's been a lot of quantitative work done on a particular topic, but there hasn't been any qualitative work done. That might be a reason why your study is really crucial, because you're bringing in those qualitative elements and looking at it from a different angle. So whatever that kind of gap is, or whatever rationale you're providing for your study, you'll want to remind the reader of that. And then you'll just provide some transitional statements by previewing the content that will be coming up in the chapter. So you can do that by basically presenting the different section headings that you'll be talking about. So those things that I mentioned on the first slide. Following the introduction, you will have the interpretation of the findings. This is really going to be the meat of the chapter. So throughout the paper, you'll be making conclusions, and you'll also provide some recommendations for practice and future research. Each of those pieces, so those conclusions and those recommendations, are really going to stem from this interpretation. So how do you make sense of what you found in your research? And then building off of that, what does that mean for the future of this particular field, for the future of additional research that will go on for this topic? So it's important to really have that solid foundation in the interpretation before you're moving on to those other pieces. Interpreting the findings means that you are relating what you found to the findings of previous research in your area of focus. So this does not just mean looking at your results and talking about them in kind of your scope or what you think they mean. It means really going back to those literature sources that you identified in chapter 2 or throughout your literature search and trying to make sense of where your study falls in the mix of all of that. So does your study confirm previous findings? Does your study differ from previous findings? Have you found anything new that hasn't been noted in previous studies? All of these things you'll want to discuss here. And your findings may differ or coincide with previous findings. That's very typical. Here, you'll just want to think about what that means. So you will start out by restating or summarizing the findings or themes. And you'll want to do this separately. So you don't want to have one big paragraph with all of your findings. You really want to section this out. So if you are doing a quantitative study, it may make sense to section this out using your research questions as subheadings. Whereas if you're doing a qualitative study, you may want to use the themes, but it really depends on the study that you're doing. So once you have restated the finding, you will want to discuss that finding in relation to any previous findings that you've already discussed in chapter 2. So again, note anywhere where your findings do not support the findings of previous studies. Also note if you've found anything new. So if your findings are, not noted in previous studies, you found something completely new that past literature hasn't discussed, that is exciting, and you should definitely note it in this interpretation as well. And then you'll want to briefly describe any examples where your findings don't support previous literature. And then based on all of those factors, you'll provide a conclusion, your conclusion of what those findings mean, and discuss what those findings mean. One other thing that's important to note here is that where your findings do not coincide with previous literature, you may want to discuss why that is. So if you, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the limitations section as well, but if there's any features of your study that may have tampered your results or have made your results different from previous findings, you'll want to talk about that. So for example, if you are doing a quantitative study and maybe your sample was not a very representative sample, that may have affected your results, and that may have implications for why your results are not in line with previous findings. So just thinking through some of those pieces of your methods that may relate to why your findings came out the way they did, and then connecting them back to previous literature. And so you'll want to do that for each research question if it's quantitative, or each theme if you're doing a qualitative study. So this should really be sectioned out by each of those things. Next, you will want to talk about the limitations. So for this piece, I recommend referring back to your original proposal. Typically in that proposal, you would have outlined or anticipated any limitations for your study. So that might be a good starting point to give you ideas for this section here. One thing to note here is that limitations should only be things that occurred that had the potential to change your results. So I just want to make sure to draw the distinction between a challenge in your data collection, data analysis, versus an actual limitation. Some limitations that you might describe are things like not being able to access a particular data set or not being able to achieve a specific sample size. One common feature or common issue that we're seeing with sample size is that maybe due to restrictions because of the pandemic, you weren't able to recruit the sample that you intended, or you weren't able to, have as many people taking your survey as you intended, or even participating in a qualitative interview, depending on the modality of those data collection activities. So those are just a few limitations that you might note. But generally look back to that proposal and see what you identified early on, and you can kind of resurface that and talk about it a little bit more in depth. When you're discussing it here, it will be after you've already collected your data, after you've already analyzed everything. So more likely than not, things may have come up throughout that process. So here you can really expand on that. If you are doing a quantitative study, you will also want to discuss the generalizability of your results to the larger population. So remember, generally with the quantitative studies, we're looking to have a large sample size, whereas in a qualitative study, you can have a smaller sample size because we are not really looking to generalize with those qualitative methods. But if you are doing a quantitative study, especially if you have used random sampling or a different type of method like convenience sampling, you'll just want to talk about that here and discuss how your sampling method related to the potential generalizability. So a random sample is typically kind of the best that you can use in order to really get that representative sample. If you use something different, like a purposive sample, you may want to mention that as a potential limitation where you're not reaching, that very representative sample size. And then just another note on qualitative studies. Again, those do have sample sizes that are smaller in nature. In a qualitative study, you're usually interviewing a sample of maybe 20 people at maximum. So it's worth talking about that as well, and just explaining that due to the nature of your research method, generalizability is not necessarily the intention, but instead that qualitative study is really meant to shed light and insight on the specific phenomenon that you're studying. So those are just a few things that you will want to note here in the limitations section. And of course, any additional limitations that you may have experienced throughout your data collection and data analysis. Now, the next two slides are meant to talk about why your findings are important. So in the beginning, you explained what your findings are, and now you're really going to talk about what that means in the real world. So in the implications for practice, you will want to talk about how your findings inform the particular population that you're talking about. So let's say you were doing a study of nurse practitioners working in rural clinical settings. If that's what your study is about, you want to take those findings and now you want to talk about, based on everything I found, how can this affect nurse practitioners in that setting, right? What did I find that can help, or what did I find that hinders their practice? So here, this is going to really rely on your content expertise in your particular PhD program, because this is where you're going to be drawing on your knowledge of whatever the topic is that you're studying. What are the gaps? What are things that people in that particular profession or in that setting need? And how is your study serving those needs? So again, relating this back to the purpose of your study and what you set out to do, Now thinking about how do those findings achieve that purpose, or how do they better inform the purpose that you've outlined? So here you may also want to weave in the particular theory that you're using for your study. If you're using maybe some type of behavioral theory to underpin your study, here you'll want to weave in how that theory really applies to the findings, and then the implications for practice as well. And then the last section, or the second to last section really, of your discussion is going to be the recommendations for future research. So here again, you are going to explain to your reader how your findings contribute to those recommendations. So this is why it's so important to really make sure that interpretation has a very solid foundation and you've really thought through your interpretation of your results, because these pieces will all stem from that. So any finding that you have that is new or unexpected, you can potentially recommend further research on that. So that might look like if you found that nurse practitioners in rural settings are really hungry for professional development opportunities, and maybe that hasn't been noted in previous literature. This is where you might recommend a good direction for future research is to explore what particular professional development opportunities nurse practitioners in rural settings are looking for. So this is where you can kind of expand a little bit and identify any places in your study where you think, oh, that was really cool, but I didn't have time to research that, or that wasn't the intention of my study. But I think that future research should branch off of what I've done and look into that a little bit more deeply. Your recommendations for future research can also be based in your limitations. So anything that you have identified as a limitation, it could potentially be modified, and then the study could be replicated. So for example, if your sample size was not what you had hoped it would be, or if your sample size, or if your sampling method is something that you think could be changed. So if you used a purposive sample and you think the study would be better suited with a random sample, well, that's a good recommendation for future research as well. You can also recommend modifications to the actual research method or design that you've used. So if you have done a quantitative study and after going through your results, you feel that you've got some good results, but you didn't really get down to the why of whatever you've observed. So maybe you're observing rates of substance misuse in a particular population, and you look at the results and you're seeing, okay, yes, I've got this frequency distribution of substance misuse in my population, and I'm seeing that this group of people is engaging in substance misuse at a higher rate than this group of people, or one group has a higher association of substance misuse. You may then say, well, why? Why is that happening? And one recommendation for future research could be to dig a little deeper and maybe use a qualitative method to interview people in that population to find out that why. So here's where you can really be creative and kind of think of your study and think, if I did it differently, or if I wanted to distill down to any particular feature or finding, what more could future researchers do on this topic? And then if you have findings that are inconclusive with previous findings, so if all the studies you've found say that maybe substance use is prevalent in one population, and then through your study, you're finding that it's prevalent in a different population, well, you've kind of opened the door now for the fields of literature to really explore this new finding from different angles. So again, just identifying what can be done to understand more about a particular finding that you've identified. And that goes as well. So for those novel findings, if you find anything new throughout your dissertation, those are really good channels for future research as well. And then you will cap off your discussion chapter with a summary. So very similar to those previous chapters. The first thing you will want to do is just recap the major points from the chapter. So really highlight each of those sections that we've talked about, the bigger takeaways. So what was a large limitation in your study? What was the general interpretation that you had? And then what are the key findings that you want your reader to take away with them? So when you're writing that summary, try to think of if your reader had no time to read your chapter and could only read the summary, what are those big pieces that you want them to walk away from your study knowing? And then once you've done that, you've completed your discussion, and in turn, you've completed your dissertation. So I will open it up for questions now. If you have any, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And we have put some links in the chat related to our resources, but there's some information about our services on this slide as well. Again, we do offer a free 30-minute consultation that's available for Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time. And in that consultation, what you can expect is to talk about your research, talk about what type of support you think you need or what areas you're struggling with. And then our team will identify how our mentors can best help. But again, thank you all for joining. If you don't have any questions, I hope to see you in the next webinar, but I will stay on for a few minutes here to answer questions.